My name is Nora. I am 31 years old, and when I married the man of my dreams, I decided to keep one important detail a secret. I never told my husband about the $90 million my four-star general father left me. Thank God I kept my mouth shut. Just 1 week after our wedding, my mother-in-law showed up at our door with an attorney and a demand that shattered my marriage entirely. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart a toxic family member who underestimated your true worth. Growing up, my father taught me that military precision applies to everything, especially protecting yourself from people who only see your bank account. After he passed, I inherited his fortune, but chose a quiet life. I run a boutique art consulting and luxury furniture appraisal business. It lets me work with beautiful things without drawing unwanted attention to my net worth. When I met Declan, he was 34, charming and ambitious. He worked in finance and talked about building a corporate empire. We fell in love. We moved into a stunning Boston townhouse right before the wedding. Declan told his family he bought the place to provide for his new wife. He bragged about it endlessly. The truth was, I bought the house through my anonymous holding company Vanguard Holdings and let him pay a fraction of the market rent just to protect his fragile ego. I loved him, so I let him play provider. It was exactly 1 week after our wedding. We were sitting at the marble kitchen island of the Boston townhouse eating scrambled eggs. The morning sun poured through the bay windows. Everything felt perfectly domestic and happy. Then a loud knock echoed through the hallway. Declan looked confused, setting down his coffee mug. I walked over and opened the heavy oak door. Beatrice, my 60-year-old mother-in-law, pushed past me without a greeting. She wore a tailored coat and carried a luxury handbag that cost more than her vehicle. Right behind her was a man in a cheap suit carrying a scuffed leather briefcase. His eyes darted around our foyer, taking in the crown molding and original artwork. Beatrice marched straight into the kitchen where Declan was still sitting. She slammed a thick stack of legal documents onto the marble island right next to his plate. I walked back into the room, crossing my arms firmly over my chest. I asked her what she thought she was doing barging into our home uninvited. Beatrice looked at me with an expression of pure disgust. She pointed a manicured finger directly at my face and told me she was protecting her son from a gold-digging furniture arranger. The man in the cheap suit stepped forward and introduced himself as her personal attorney. He explained in a condescending tone that the documents on the table constituted a strict postnuptial agreement. I looked at Declan, expecting him to stand up and defend his new wife. Instead, he shrank back in his stool, suddenly finding his coffee mug extremely fascinating. I asked him if he knew anything about this ambush. He would not even make eye contact. He mumbled something pathetic about family protocol and how his mother just wanted to make sure the family assets remained secure. Beatrice sneered and proudly declared that Declan was too soft-hearted to see my true intentions. She said I had manipulated him into marrying me so I could eventually take half of this beautiful townhouse and drain his hard-earned bank accounts. She said she would never allow a woman who peddles old chairs for a living to leech off her son's financial success. The sheer audacity of the situation was staggering. Declan, a man who constantly complained to me about his mounting credit card debt, was sitting there letting his mother portray him as some wealthy tycoon while painting me as a desperate opportunist. He finally looked up and told me to just sign the papers. He claimed it was merely a formality to give his mother peace of mind and that nothing between us would change. The attorney slid a pen across the marble counter. He warned me that refusing to sign the papers would initiate immediate annulment proceedings based on fraudulent financial disclosure on my part. The absolute irony of that specific threat nearly made me laugh out loud. I looked down at the thick postnuptial agreement. The bold letters demanded a complete surrender of any claim to the Boston townhouse and any of Declan's current or future financial assets. It stated that in the unfortunate event of a divorce, I would walk away with absolutely nothing but the personal items I brought into the marriage. Beatrice crossed her arms and tapped her foot eagerly, waiting for me to throw a tantrum. She desperately wanted a fight. She wanted to prove to Declan that I was only after his money. I took a deep breath, picking up the pen. I did not cry. I did not yell. I simply offered her a cold, calculated smile. I leaned over the kitchen island and signed my name on every dotted line without a second thought. Beatrice snatched the documents off the counter and told Declan that she had just saved his life from a terrible mistake. They walked out of the house. Declan sighed, thanking me for understanding his mother. I pulled away. What neither Beatrice nor Declan realized was the massive mistake they had just made. By forcing me to sign that document, they legally severed themselves from my $90 million empire. They believed they were locking me out of a townhouse Declan falsely claimed he owned. They had no idea the house belonged entirely to my private company. The malicious trap they set had just become their financial tomb. Before Beatrice even reached the front door, she stopped dead in her tracks and turned back around. Her sharp eyes darted past me and looked straight out the large bay window toward the cobblestone driveway. Parked outside was my vintage silver Porsche. It was meticulously restored, a vehicle I quietly purchased for myself using one of my smaller shell companies. Declan, ever the insecure showman, had proudly announced at our wedding reception that the car was his ultimate surprise gift to me. He had stood before all our guests, boasted about how he scoured the entire East Coast to find the perfect car for his beautiful bride. I simply let him have his glory, knowing the title was locked safely in my private vault. Now Beatrice pointed that manicured finger toward the driveway. She demanded that I hand over the keys to the Porsche immediately. She claimed the car was purchased with her son's money, so it fell under the protection of the post-nuptial agreement I had just signed. She said a woman who appraises old furniture had no business driving a luxury sports car. Declan stood frozen near the kitchen island, his face flushing a deep crimson. Admitting to his mother he had not paid a dime for that car would destroy his wealthy facade. I refused, looking Beatrice right in the eye. I kept my voice perfectly level and told her that transfers required legal review. I stated that until my counsel examined the specific vehicular clauses in her hastily drafted document, those keys would stay exactly where they were. The sleazy attorney leaned in and whispered something into Beatrice's ear. She scowled, displeased that she could not strip me of everything in one morning, but she relented. She told Declan to keep a close eye on his assets and marched out the door. Declan refused to meet my gaze after they left. He grabbed his briefcase and practically ran out the front door. I did not chase after him or demand an apology. I simply cleared the breakfast dishes, wiped down the marble counters, and went upstairs to my home office. I spent the next few hours immersed in my actual work, reviewing auction catalogs and verifying the authenticity of several high-value paintings for a private client in London. The work kept my mind detached from the drama unfolding downstairs. Around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I walked downstairs to make a cup of green tea. I glanced out the bay window while waiting for the water to boil. The front cobblestone driveway was completely empty. The vintage silver Porsche was gone. My phone buzzed in my pocket a few seconds later. It was a text message from Declan. He wrote that he noticed an engine rattle and called a towing service to take it to a specialized mechanic for routine maintenance. The lie was poorly constructed and almost insulting. That car ran perfectly. I had personally overseen its mechanical restoration just a month prior. I walked over to the entryway console table where I always kept a spare set of keys. They were missing. Declan had stolen the car. I sat down on the velvet bench in the foyer and opened my laptop. It took less than 10 minutes to access the GPS tracking software installed in the vehicle. The beacon showed the Porsche was not at any mechanic shop. It was parked in the back lot of a questionable title loan and luxury pawn facility located 2 towns over. The pieces of the puzzle snapped into place with brilliant clarity. Declan was liquidating my assets to save himself. I knew from the private investigator I had hired before our wedding that Beatrice lived far beyond her means. She portrayed herself as a wealthy socialite, but she was deeply entrenched in a dangerous gambling habit. She owed massive debts to a private poker ring. Declan had clearly pawned the title of the Porsche to secure a rapid cash loan, desperate to cover his mother's staggering gambling debts before the club expelled her. He thought he could leverage the post-nuptial agreement to claim ownership, pawn the car for quick cash, and figure out a way to retrieve it before I demanded it back. He was completely wrong. A normal bride might have collapsed onto the floor in tears. I did no such thing. Tears are a useless currency. and anger only clouds good judgment. I felt nothing but a cold, sharp sense of clarity. The trap they had tried to set for me was simply an invitation to build a much larger cage for them. I walked into my home office, locked the doors, and moved to the built-in bookshelf. I reached behind a stack of thick art history encyclopedias and pressed a hidden button. A small section of the shelving popped open, revealing a hidden steel wall safe. I entered the biometric passcode, and the heavy door swung outward. Inside lay the true documentation of my life. Deeds to multiple commercial properties across the country, corporate structural diagrams for Vanguard Holdings, and a simple black burner phone. I took the burner phone out and powered it on. I dialed a highly secure international number. It rang exactly twice before a crisp, professional voice answered on the other end. It was the senior director of my private wealth management firm. I told him that the perimeter had been breached and that my new husband and his mother had just initiated a hostile financial action against me. I explained that they had unlawfully pawned a vehicle belonging to one of our subsidiary shell companies. I did not ask him to retrieve the car. I told him to let them keep the cash they had just stolen. I instructed him to immediately prepare the next phase of our defensive strategy. It was time to completely sever their financial lifelines, block their access to my hidden credit accounts, and prepare for economic retaliation. The first step of that economic retaliation was surgically precise. I held the black burner phone to my ear and listened as my wealth manager typed rapidly on his end of the secure connection. I instructed him to immediately freeze the 4 premium credit cards I had discreetly established for Declan during our engagement. When we first started dating, Declan constantly complained about his low credit limits and how his financial firm frowned upon employees with poor financial portfolios. Playing the supportive partner, I used one of my corporate subsidiaries to issue him high-limit corporate cards. I listed him as an authorized executive, allowing him to flash the heavy metal cards at business dinners and pretend he was a master of the universe. In reality, it was an allowance. I paid the balances in full every month from an anonymous trust to keep his fragile ego intact. Now I told my manager to cut the cord entirely. He confirmed the accounts were locked, flagged for suspicious activity, and suspended indefinitely. I ended the call, placed the burner phone back into the wall safe, and closed the heavy steel door. I walked over to the bay window, looking at the empty space where my vintage car had been parked just hours ago. I felt a deep sense of calm settling over me. The trap was armed. Meanwhile, halfway across the city, Declan and Beatrice were busy celebrating their supposed victory. They had chosen L'Etoile, one of the most exclusive and notoriously expensive Michelin star restaurants in the entire metropolitan area. Reservations usually required a 6-month wait, but Beatrice had undoubtedly used her country club connections to secure a prime table right in the center of the dining room. I knew exactly where they were because my phone buzzed with the initial authorization ping when Declan handed his card to the host to hold the reservation. They were dining under crystal chandeliers, completely oblivious to the financial guillotine swinging down toward them. They ordered the tasting menu, complete with imported caviar Wagyu beef and bottles of vintage champagne that cost more than my monthly grocery bill. Beatrice laughed loudly, tossing her hair back and toasting to her own brilliance. She probably praised Declan for finally putting me in my place, convincing him that pawning my car was a stroke of financial genius. They were swimming in a fantasy of unearned wealth, acting like royalty who had successfully conquered a peasant. The performance lasted right up until the dessert plates were cleared and the leather checkbook was placed gracefully on their table. Declan, brimming with manufactured confidence, barely glanced at the astronomical total before sliding his premium metal card into the leather folio. He handed it back to the waiter with a dismissive wave, returning his attention to whatever arrogant story his mother was telling. The waiter bowed slightly and walked away toward the point-of-sale terminal. Less than 3 minutes later, the waiter returned. His professional demeanor remained intact, but his voice carried clearly across the quiet, sophisticated dining room. He leaned in and politely informed Declan that the card had been declined. Declan chuckled, assuming it was a simple bank error or a fraud protection trigger due to the unusually high bill. He casually reached into his wallet and produced a second premium card, handing it over with an annoyed sigh. The waiter took it, walked away, and returned even faster this time. He placed the card on the table and stated that this card was also completely frozen. Declan's face lost all its color. He frantically dug through his wallet, pulling out his personal bank debit card. The waiter swiped it right there at the table, using a handheld terminal. Insufficient funds flashed on the bright digital screen. Beatrice stopped smiling. Her eyes darted around the elegant dining room as conversations at nearby tables began to pause. Wealthy patrons turned their heads observing the unfolding spectacle. Beatrice demanded that the waiter try the cards again, insisting that their machines must be broken. She raised her voice, her tone turning shrill and aggressive. She yelled that they were important people and that this level of incompetence was unacceptable for a Michelin star establishment. The restaurant manager quickly approached the table, his face a mask of polite severity. He informed Beatrice that there was nothing wrong with their machines. He firmly requested another form of payment, warning them that failure to settle the bill would result in a call to the local authorities. Beatrice shrieked, slamming her hands on the table and causing her crystal water glass to tip over and shatter loudly. Declan scrambled up from his chair, his hands shaking violently. He muttered a frantic apology to the manager and practically sprinted toward the restaurant foyer, pulling his phone from his jacket pocket. Back at the townhouse, I was sitting on the velvet bench in the hallway, filing my nails. My personal cell phone began ringing. Declan's name flashed on the bright screen. I let it ring 4 times before calmly pressing the answer button. I did not say hello, I just waited. Declan was breathing heavily, his voice high-pitched and cracking with sheer panic. He demanded to know what was happening with the bank accounts. He asked if I had accidentally reported the cards stolen. He stammered that he was standing in the middle of L'Etoile, and the manager was threatening to call the police because every single card was declining. He begged me to call the bank and authorize the transaction immediately because his mother was having a public meltdown. He said everyone was staring at them and they were going to be arrested if I did not fix this instantly. I listened to his frantic, breathless rambling without showing a single ounce of emotion. I took a slow, deep breath. I kept my voice incredibly soft. I am just a freelance furniture appraiser, remember, check with your bank. Then I simply hung up. I tossed the phone onto the plush velvet cushion and walked into the kitchen to pour myself another cup of tea. The fallout from the restaurant incident was handled entirely by Declan and his desperate scrambling. He never mentioned the humiliating details when he finally dragged himself home hours later, looking utterly defeated and smelling faintly of cheap street food. He loudly claimed there was a massive banking glitch and that he had to call in a favor from a junior colleague to cover the astronomical bill. I just smiled, handed him a glass of ice water, and went upstairs to read. He spent the next few weeks tiptoeing around me, terrified that I might ask questions about his finances. I never did. I just waited for the holiday season to arrive. Thanksgiving descended upon Boston with a bitter, biting frost. The trees along our cobblestone street were bare, and the sky hung heavy with gray clouds. Inside the townhouse, the air was warm and smelled of roasted turkey, sage stuffing, and spiced apple cider. I had spent the entire morning preparing a feast fit for royalty. However, my most important preparation had nothing to do with culinary skills. I carefully positioned my primary smartphone on the edge of the marble kitchen island, ensuring the voice memo application was running quietly in the background. I also activated the ambient recording features on the discrete security cameras integrated into the living room bookcases. Every single word spoken in my home today would be captured, categorized, and filed away for future legal use. The front door swung open at exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Beatrice barged in without knocking, shedding her heavy mink coat and tossing it carelessly over the antique mahogany banister. She did not greet me. Instead, she loudly announced that the house felt incredibly drafty and demanded that someone turn up the thermostat. Declan scurried behind her, carrying 2 cheap bottles of wine that he proudly presented as vintage reserves. Beatrice strutted directly into the kitchen, running her manicured fingers over the polished countertops, checking for dust. She looked at me wearing an apron over my silk blouse and sighed with theatrical disappointment. She told me to stop standing around looking lost and fetch her a glass of sparkling water with exactly 2 cubes of ice and a wedge of lemon. I complied with a polite, chilling smile. I handed her the glass just as the doorbell rang again. This time it was Penelope Declan's 36-year-old sister, accompanied by her husband Jamal. Penelope was a carbon copy of Beatrice draped in designer labels purchased on credit and wearing an expression of permanent dissatisfaction. Jamal was different. He was a highly successful corporate attorney, a sharp and observant black man, who always seemed slightly amused by his extended family and their ridiculous behavior. Jamal offered me a warm, genuine smile and handed me a beautiful bouquet of autumnal flowers. He actually thanked me for hosting the family holiday. Penelope simply pushed past him, complaining about the terrible holiday traffic and demanding to know when the food would be ready because she was absolutely starving. I directed them to the living room, where Beatrice had already claimed the most comfortable velvet armchair by the fireplace. She sat there like a reigning monarch holding court. I returned to the kitchen to finalize the gravy and carve the turkey. I could hear their voices carrying clearly across the open floor plan. Beatrice was loudly praising Declan for providing such a beautiful home for his new wife. Penelope chimed in, saying it was incredibly generous of Declan to let me play house in a multi-million-dollar property. She laughed a high-pitched grating sound and wondered aloud how a woman who basically moves old chairs around for a living managed to land a man with such a robust financial portfolio. Declan soaked up their praise, puffing out his chest and agreeing that he always took care of his family. I carried the heavy silver platter bearing the roasted turkey into the dining room. I set it down, gently arranging the side dishes with meticulous precision. Beatrice took her seat at the head of the table, a position usually reserved for the host, without asking permission. She immediately began inspecting the silverware, holding a fork up to the light to check for water spots. She loudly instructed me to bring extra napkins because she anticipated the meal might be somewhat messy. Penelope sat down next to her mother, eyeing the mashed potatoes with blatant suspicion. She asked if I had used real butter, claiming she was on a very strict diet and could not tolerate cheap ingredients. I smiled brightly, assuring her that I only used the finest organic butter imported directly from a specialized dairy farm in France. Throughout the meal, Beatrice and Penelope treated me like hired help rather than a daughter-in-law. When Beatrice finished her wine, she did not ask if there was more. She simply held her empty glass in the air and snapped her fingers in my direction, stating that her cup was dry. I stood up, retrieved the bottle, and poured her another serving. Penelope then launched into a detailed, patronizing lecture about the importance of having a real career. She looked right at me and asked how my little furniture hobby was going. She suggested that if I ever wanted to contribute meaningfully to the household expenses, she could probably find me a clerical position answering phones at a local real estate office. Jamal stopped eating. He lowered his fork and stared at his wife, clearly appalled by her blatant disrespect. He opened his mouth to defend me, but I caught his eye across the table and gave him a subtle, almost imperceptible shake of my head. I needed no savior. I needed them to keep talking. I wanted them to feel entirely comfortable displaying their toxic entitlement. I kept quiet. The heavy tension in the dining room lingered as the final plates were cleared. Jamal, who had rushed in late from his corporate law firm just as we sat down to eat, was the only person who offered to help me carry the heavy silver serving platters back to the kitchen. He stood beside me at the marble sink, quietly stacking the fine china. He looked at me with a genuine expression of apology and softly mentioned that I did not deserve the harsh treatment his wife and mother-in-law were dishing out. He thanked me again for the incredible meal and complimented the roasted turkey. I smiled, appreciating his rare display of basic human decency in a house currently overflowing with unwarranted arrogance. Jamal was a sharp, highly observant 35-year-old black man who had built a formidable reputation in the legal world. He missed very little, and his analytical mind was always working, evaluating the people and spaces around him. After helping me in the kitchen, Jamal walked back toward the living room to pour himself a glass of scotch from the wet bar. Declan was sprawled out on the velvet sofa, loosening his tie and boasting to Penelope about an imaginary stock trade he claimed to have executed earlier that week. Jamal stepped up to the polished mahogany bar cart, reaching for a crystal tumbler. As he poured the amber liquid, his gaze drifted upward and locked onto the wall just above the fireplace mantel. Hanging there was a subtle, mesmerizing abstract painting. It was a textured canvas filled with deep indigo hues, fractured geometric lines, and sweeping strokes of genuine gold leaf. I had acquired the piece during a private gallery showing in Geneva 3 years ago. It was a masterpiece, but its brilliance was intentionally understated. An untrained eye would simply see a nice decoration matching the modern aesthetic of the townhouse. Jamal, however, did not have an untrained eye. His parents were avid art collectors, and his corporate legal work frequently involved massive estate valuations and high-level asset transfers. Jamal slowly lowered his glass, stepping closer to the fireplace to examine the canvas. He studied the distinct brushwork, the intricate layering of the oil paint, and the faint, almost invisible signature tucked into the bottom right corner. A profound shift occurred in his posture. The relaxed, casual demeanor of a man enjoying a holiday evening vanished, replaced instantly by the rigid focus of an attorney uncovering a massive discrepancy in a witness testimony. Declan noticed Jamal staring at the wall. He puffed out his chest, eager to seize another opportunity to parade his fabricated wealth. Declan stood up, walking over to join his brother-in-law. He loudly patted Jamal on the shoulder, pointing at the canvas with extreme confidence. Declan proudly announced that he had picked up the piece at an exclusive charity auction a few months before the wedding. He chuckled, claiming he managed to steal it from the other bidders for just a few $1,000s. He waved his hand dismissively, telling Jamal that he simply liked the colors and thought it would perfectly tie the living room together, adding that it was a nice little starter piece for his real estate portfolio. Jamal turned his head slowly, looking at Declan with an expression of complete disbelief, masking a sudden, sharp realization. Jamal knew exactly what that painting was. He had read about its private sale in an international art quarterly. The canvas hanging in my living room was a rare, heavily sought-after original masterpiece. It was currently valued at a minimum of $2 million on the open market. It was absolutely not the kind of artwork someone accidentally purchased at a local charity auction for a few $1,000s. Furthermore, Jamal knew the exact salary bracket for a mid-level finance employee at Declan's specific firm. Even if Declan saved every single penny of his annual income for a decade, he could never afford the insurance premiums on that painting, let alone the purchase price. Jamal took a slow sip of his scotch, his sharp eyes darting from the $2 million painting to the boastful, financially drowning man standing next to him. Declan was standing in a multi-million-dollar townhouse pretending to be a wealthy provider, while completely unaware that a museum-grade fortune was hanging right above his head. The mathematical impossibility of Declan's narrative struck Jamal like a physical blow. Declan was lying. He was lying about the art, he was lying about his finances, and he was clearly lying about owning this magnificent property. Jamal looked across the room and locked eyes with me as I walked out of the kitchen holding a tray of desserts. I met his gaze with total calm. I did not break eye contact, nor did I offer any explanation. I just gave him a small, knowing smile. In that exact moment, the brilliant corporate lawyer pieced the entire puzzle together. Jamal realized that Beatrice and Penelope were ruthlessly mocking a woman they believed was a broke furniture appraiser while sitting in a house funded by an invisible empire. He realized that his arrogant brother-in-law was nothing more than a pathetic fraud, playing dress-up in a kingdom built by the quiet woman serving the pie. Jamal did not expose the lie. He did not confront Declan or alert his arrogant wife. He simply nodded at me, a silent gesture of profound respect and sudden understanding. He walked back to his armchair, sitting down with his drink. He watched Beatrice and Penelope continue their oblivious, arrogant chatter. Jamal leaned back, taking another slow sip of his scotch, fully realizing that the boastful family he had married into was currently dancing on the edge of a massive, self-inflicted financial slaughter. He knew the trap was set, and he was more than happy to sit back and watch them walk right into it. Jamal settled deeper into his plush armchair, the heavy crystal glass cool against his palm, his sharp eyes tracking the absurd theater unfolding in my living room. I moved seamlessly from the dining area to the spacious kitchen, carrying the heavy roasted turkey on a massive silver platter. The delicious aroma of toasted sage and melted butter filled the entire space, creating a stark contrast to the bitter toxicity radiating constantly from my mother-in-law and sister-in-law. Beatrice was loudly complaining about the ambient temperature again, demanding that Declan immediately adjust the thermostat, because her vintage silk blouse was simply too thin for brutal Boston winters. Declan jumped up to comply, playing the dutiful, wealthy son with pathetic, eager enthusiasm. I placed the turkey exactly at the center of the table, arranging the crystal bowls of homemade cranberry sauce and roasted winter vegetables perfectly around it. Beatrice immediately claimed the head seat, a deliberate and calculated slight designed specifically to remind me of my supposed lesser place in the hierarchy of this household. Penelope sat directly to her right, already eyeing the various side dishes, with a look of manufactured disdain. Jamal took his seat slowly, shooting me another brief, highly knowing glance before focusing his attention entirely on his plate. He was silently waiting for the inevitable explosion to finally occur. I took my designated seat at the opposite end of the vast dining table. I poured myself a generous glass of robust red wine and watched the evening performance continue. Beatrice dominated the conversation exactly as she always did at every gathering. She spoke at incredible length about her elite country club, wildly exaggerating her influence among the local wealthy socialites and shamelessly dropping names of prominent politicians she falsely claimed to know intimately. Declan nodded along enthusiastically, desperate for her maternal validation, interjecting occasionally to boast loudly about a fictitious promotion he was expecting at his mid-level finance firm. Penelope chimed in next to complain bitterly about her suburban neighbors, whining that their terrible landscaping choices were completely driving down her local property values. It was a fascinating, horrifying symphony of pure delusion. I simply smiled, politely passing the silver gravy boat and offering small nods whenever a silent pause demanded my brief participation. I knew deeply that Beatrice had a specific malicious agenda for this dinner. The subtle, highly nervous energy radiating from Declan gave the entire game away entirely. He kept nervously wiping his sweating palms on his expensive trousers and shooting highly anxious, frantic glances at his mother across the table. The financial news I had tightened around his neck earlier that week was clearly cutting off his air supply. He was incredibly desperate for cash, and Beatrice was preparing to offer him a lifeline built entirely on a massive delusion. Beatrice tapped her heavy silver fork against her delicate crystal wine glass, the sharp ringing sound cutting through the dining room chatter and commanding absolute immediate silence. She stood up dramatically, smoothing the imaginary wrinkles from her expensive silk blouse, and projected her voice loud enough, as if addressing a crowded auditorium instead of a small family dinner. She proudly announced that she had gathered everyone today, not just to give thanks, but to share some incredibly exciting news regarding the glorious future of the entire family legacy. She firmly declared that after months of careful planning and securing elite business partnerships, she was officially launching her own luxury wellness spa, right in the upscale heart of downtown Boston. Penelope gasped in sheer, unadulterated delight, clapping her hands together enthusiastically and loudly declaring that her mother was a true visionary who deserved massive success. Beatrice happily soaked up the loud applause, bowing her head modestly before preparing to finally deliver the fatal blow. She proudly announced to the table that to secure the premium commercial real estate required for such an exclusive venue, her brilliant son had graciously agreed to act as her primary financial investor. She loudly proclaimed to the entire room that Declan was taking out a massive second mortgage on this beautiful, historic townhouse to fully fund the initial capital required for her grand spa. Penelope cheered even louder, reaching her hand across the wide table to grab Declan tightly by the arm, aggressively praising him for being the ultimate provider and an incredibly dedicated son. Declan puffed out his chest proudly, wearing a highly smug, arrogant grin as he shamelessly basked in their toxic adulation. Jamal immediately stopped eating his dinner. He set his heavy fork down on the expensive porcelain plate with a loud, deliberate clink that echoed sharply through the room. The incredibly sharp corporate lawyer looked directly at his brother-in-law, his facial expression turning deadly serious. Jamal asked Declan, his deep voice incredibly calm, but heavily laced with razor-sharp legal scrutiny, if he had actually bothered to consult his wife before leveraging their primary residence for a highly dangerous commercial venture. Declan scoffed loudly, waving his hand dismissively in my direction, with absolute unfiltered contempt. He looked Jamal right in the eye and arrogantly declared that he did not need to consult anyone because it was his house, and therefore his rules. The entire room fell completely dead silent, the sheer disrespect hanging heavy and suffocating in the tense air. Beatrice smirked widely, clearly thrilled by her son, putting me firmly in my subordinate place. I did not flinch once. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of anger. I slowly lifted my crystal glass, took a long, measured sip of my red wine, placed the glass gently back on the wooden table, and quietly said that I would absolutely love to see the bank approve that. I watched his confident smile waver for just a fraction of a second, completely unaware of the financial devastation marching straight toward him right now. His arrogance blinded him to the reality his world was about to collapse. 2 days passed in quiet anticipation after that miserable holiday dinner. The temperature in Boston dropped significantly, bringing a sharp, biting chill to the air. It was a crisp Tuesday morning. I decided to spend my time sitting out on our enclosed heated glass patio. I wore a thick cashmere sweater and held a steaming mug of jasmine tea in my left hand. In my right hand, I balanced a rare art book. The quiet was exactly what I needed. I knew today was the day Declan planned to execute his foolish financial maneuver. He had barely spoken to me since the holiday, too consumed with impressing his mother and securing the capital for her ridiculous luxury spa venture. He truly believed he held all the cards. At exactly 10 o'clock, the heavy oak front door swung open. Declan marched into the foyer, his chest puffed out with manufactured pride. Right behind him walked a sharply dressed man carrying a thick leather briefcase. This was clearly the bank loan officer. I watched them through the glass doors of the patio, observing the pathetic performance unfolding in my own hallway. Declan gestured expansively at the high ceilings, the hardwood floors. He gave the banker a grand tour, talking about the immense value of the property and how much money he had poured into the recent renovations. It was a complete fabrication. I had hired the contractors and paid for every single upgrade using my private corporate accounts. Declan had not contributed a single penny to this house. The banker nodded politely, taking notes on a small digital tablet. He looked impressed by the sheer scale of the townhouse, which only fueled Declan's massive ego even further. Declan led the banker into the spacious modern kitchen, pulling out a stool at the marble island. He offered the man a bottle of sparkling water, acting the gracious, wealthy host. I remained seated on the patio, casually turning the pages of my book. I positioned myself so I had a clear line of sight into the kitchen, ensuring I would not miss the impending collision. Declan pointed a finger in my direction, speaking to the banker in a low, condescending tone. He loudly explained that his wife was just a freelance furniture appraiser who enjoyed reading and staying out of his complex financial affairs. The banker offered a tight, polite smile, clearly eager to get down to business. He opened his briefcase and pulled out loan application documents. He set his laptop on the marble counter, booting it up to access the bank's secure real estate database. Declan leaned against the counter, crossing his arms and projecting an air of supreme arrogance. He declared that his credit score was impeccable and expected the lowest interest rate for this second mortgage. He boasted about his position at the finance firm, wildly inflating his actual salary and claiming he was on the fast track to a senior partnership. He assured the banker that funding his mother's new business venture was merely a minor strategic investment. The loan officer began typing rapidly on his keyboard. He asked Declan to confirm his full legal name and social security number for the final property verification check. Declan provided the information with a smug, satisfied grin. He was already spending the money in his mind, envisioning the lavish praise his mother would shower upon him once the funds were secured. I took a slow sip of my jasmine tea, my eyes fixed on the banker's face. The transformation happened almost instantly. The banker stopped typing. He leaned closer to the laptop screen, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. He pressed a few more keys, refreshing the county property registry database. The color rapidly drained from his face. He looked up at Declan, his expression shifting from polite professionalism to intense, uncomfortable scrutiny. The banker swallowed hard, adjusting his glasses. He pushed the laptop slightly away and cleared his throat. He informed Declan that there seemed to be a massive discrepancy in the paperwork. Declan chuckled dismissively, waving his hand and claiming that bureaucratic systems were always prone to errors. He confidently told the banker to just push the approval through anyway. The loan officer did not smile. He sat up straight, his voice turning cold and strictly professional. He stated clearly that he could not authorize any mortgage, nor could he proceed with any financial negotiations regarding this specific property. Declan's arrogant grin instantly vanished. He demanded to know why, his voice rising in sudden frantic panic. He yelled that he was a finance executive and that his application was flawless. The banker shook his head slowly, looking at Declan with a mixture of pity and severe suspicion. He stated that the application was fraudulent. He revealed that Declan's name was nowhere to be found on the property deed. The banker tapped the laptop screen, reading the verified legal registration aloud. He announced that the Boston townhouse did not belong to Declan at all. The property was legally owned in its entirety by a private commercial entity known as Vanguard Holdings LLC. Declan stood completely frozen, his mouth hanging open in sheer shock. His brain scrambled to process the devastating information. He looked wildly around the kitchen, his entire fabricated reality crashing down around him in real time. The banker quickly packed up his briefcase, snapping it shut with a loud, final click. He sternly advised Declan that attempting to mortgage a property he did not own constituted severe bank fraud. He marched straight out the front door, leaving Declan standing alone in the deafening silence of his own humiliation. Declan stood completely frozen in the kitchen while the heavy oak front door slammed shut behind the loan officer. The silence in the townhouse was deafening. He stared at me through the glass of the patio doors, his face a mask of absolute terror and confusion. I did not look up from my book again. I simply let him drown in the quiet realization that his manufactured reality had shattered. He paced back and forth across the marble floor, muttering wildly under his breath. He pulled out his phone with trembling hands and dialed his mother. I could hear his frantic voice echoing through the glass. He told Beatrice that the bank denied the mortgage because a shadow corporation called Vanguard Holdings owned the property. He sounded like a terrified child seeking protection. Beatrice shrieked loud enough for me to hear her through the receiver. She immediately jumped to the most convenient delusional conclusion available to her arrogant mind. She convinced him that I had somehow stolen his money, funneled his hard-earned finance salary into a fraudulent shell company, and secretly bought the house out from under him. It was a mathematical impossibility given his miserable income, but logic never stopped Beatrice from playing the victim. By the following morning, the vicious rumor campaign had officially begun. Beatrice wasted absolutely no time weaponizing her network of superficial socialites. She marched into the dining room of her exclusive country club, the very same club where she owed massive gambling debts, and began spinning a spectacular web of lies. She told everyone who would listen that her brilliant, successful son had been ensnared by a masterful con artist. She painted a picture of me as a ruthless criminal mastermind who had manipulated Declan into marriage just to systematically drain his bank accounts. According to her wild narrative, my boutique furniture appraisal business was nothing more than a front for money laundering. She claimed I was secretly funneling Declan's non-existent fortune into Vanguard Holdings to steal the townhouse he supposedly purchased. The rumors spread through the wealthy Boston suburbs like a raging wildfire. High society thrives on scandalous gossip, and Beatrice provided them with a feast. The fallout from her smear campaign manifested quickly. I noticed the sharp, judgmental whispers when I walked into my favorite local coffee shop. Women who had smiled at me warmly just 2 weeks ago now completely averted their eyes or clutched their designer handbags a little tighter when I passed. A few peripheral acquaintances from our wedding guest list actually blocked my number and removed me from their social media networks. Declan leaned entirely into his mother's fabricated narrative. He started acting like a deeply wounded martyr around the house. He would dramatically sigh whenever I entered the room, casting himself as the tragic hero who had been swindled by a deceitful wife. He genuinely believed that if he played the victim loudly enough, the truth about his utter lack of wealth would remain hidden. He thought the public pressure would force me to surrender the property to him out of sheer embarrassment. I was profoundly mistaken. I did not care about the opinions of arrogant socialites who spent their afternoons drinking overpriced champagne and gossiping about people they barely knew. I felt zero need to defend my character against a woman who was actively drowning in illicit gambling debts. While Beatrice exhausted her energy spreading ridiculous fables at the country club, I directed my entire focus toward a much grander, infinitely more destructive objective. I sat in my secure home office with the door firmly locked, reviewing highly confidential financial dossiers on my encrypted laptop. My wealth manager remained on a secure phone line with me for hours each day. We were not discussing residential mortgages or stolen vintage cars. We were discussing corporate warfare. Declan worked as a mid-level manager at a prominent regional financial firm. He liked to act as though he ran the entire organization, but he was nothing more than a minor employee in a much larger machine. That firm was currently a subsidiary of a massive national corporate conglomerate. My private holding company, fueled by the $90 million empire my father had meticulously built, was in the final aggressive stages of executing a hostile takeover of that exact conglomerate. My legal team and financial advisors had been quietly buying up majority shares through various proxy corporations for the past 3 weeks. The acquisition was a masterful stroke of corporate strategy, and it was entirely legal. I was actively purchasing the very ground Declan walked on. I scrutinized the acquisition contracts with absolute precision. My team ensured that once the takeover was complete, the new executive board would initiate a comprehensive, ruthless audit of all existing employees at the subsidiary level. We specifically mandated a rigorous investigation into any personnel flagged for suspicious financial activity or carrying excessive personal debt. Given that Declan had recently attempted to commit bank fraud by trying to mortgage a property he did not own, his internal risk assessment profile was going to glow bright red. He was blindly walking into a professional slaughterhouse. I finalized the acquisition paperwork, pressing my pen against the signature line with immense satisfaction. I authorized the transfer of the necessary funds, effectively sealing Declan's professional fate. I closed my laptop and walked downstairs to the kitchen to prepare dinner. Declan was sitting on the sofa, aggressively typing on his phone, likely coordinating another wave of pity with his mother. He glared at me as I walked past, his chest puffed out with that same pathetic, unyarned arrogance. He truly believed his mother's gossip campaign was destroying my life. He had absolutely no idea that while he was busy complaining to his country club friends, I had just successfully purchased his entire corporate reality. The heavy silence in the house was thick with impending devastation, and I quietly relished every single second of the trap I had built. December swept into Boston with a bitter freeze that perfectly mirrored the atmosphere inside my home. The heavy silence I had relished was soon shattered by the frantic, chaotic energy of my mother-in-law. Beatrice realized that her vicious country club rumors were not enough to physically remove me from the property. She needed a grand, undeniable spectacle to save her own crumbling social standing and force my hand. She marched into the townhouse one Tuesday morning, clutching a thick leather planner, and loudly announced that Declan would be hosting the annual family Christmas gala this year. It was a carefully orchestrated ambush. Beatrice intended to pack my house with every wealthy snob, vicious gossip, and elite socialite she knew. Her ultimate goal was to publicly corner me, humiliate me in front of Boston high society, and force me to confess to embezzling Declan's non-existent fortune. Declan looked entirely panicked at the prospect of funding a massive holiday gala with zero access to his frozen credit cards. He stammered, trying to suggest a smaller dinner instead. Beatrice immediately shot him down, snapping that she had already sent out the expensive gold-foiled invitations. She told him to figure out the financing, completely oblivious to his broken finances. Declan was trapped between his desperate need for his mother's approval and the terrifying reality of his empty bank accounts. He spent days avoiding me, pacing the hallways and making hushed, panicked phone calls, trying to secure a personal loan just to pay for the holiday decorations. I watched him struggle with mild amusement. When Beatrice aggressively confronted me in the kitchen, demanding I stay out of the way and let professional caterers handle the event, I nodded. I played the intimidated, defeated wife flawlessly. I lowered my eyes, offered a soft apology, and told her I would leave the entire planning process to her superior judgment. Beatrice smirked with profound satisfaction, fully convinced she had broken my spirit. She strutted out of the kitchen, loudly declaring that she would hire the most exclusive event company in the city to ensure the evening was absolutely flawless. I let her enjoy that false sense of victory for exactly 10 minutes. As soon as the front door clicked shut, I walked into my home office and opened my secure laptop. I had absolutely no intention of letting Beatrice control the logistics of a major event happening inside my own private property. If she wanted a grand stage for her malicious theater, I would gladly provide one, but I would be the one writing the script. I contacted the executive director of a highly elite private security firm that frequently handled corporate espionage and high-threat asset protection for Vanguard Holdings. I bypassed standard catering companies entirely. I instructed the director to assemble a team of 20 highly trained operatives. They were to be impeccably dressed in standard formal service attire, posing seamlessly as waiters, bartenders, valet attendants, and kitchen staff. I authorized a massive, untraceable payment to cover their specialized services. My instructions to the security team were incredibly specific. They were not just there to serve champagne and pass around expensive appetizers. They were there to secure the perimeter, monitor every single guest, and most importantly, keep a relentless invisible watch on Declan and Beatrice. I required discreet audio surveillance in the main entertaining areas and real-time video feeds directed straight to my encrypted phone. The director assured me his team would operate flawlessly under the guise of premium hospitality. Beatrice believed she was bringing an army of vipers into my home to destroy me, completely unaware I had just surrounded her with highly trained professionals answering exclusively to my command. The week leading up to the gala tested my endurance. Delivery trucks arrived daily, unloading massive frosted pine wreaths, thousands of twinkling lights and towering ice sculptures Beatrice impulsively ordered on credit. Declan looked increasingly ill with every invoice that crossed the threshold, his skin pale and his eyes darting nervously. He was drowning in debt just to fund his mother's revenge fantasy. The morning of the party arrived. The townhouse was transformed into a glittering, extravagant winter wonderland. Fresh pine and roasted chestnuts filled the air. My undercover security team arrived exactly on time, slipping seamlessly into their roles. The men wore sharp black tuxedos, and the women wore elegant formal service attire. They moved with a quiet, lethal efficiency that standard caterers simply did not possess. I stood on the second-floor landing, watching them arrange the crystal champagne flutes and silver serving platters. The lead operative posing as the head butler gave me a subtle, reassuring nod. Everything was firmly in place. At 7 o'clock sharp, the heavy oak doors opened to receive the first wave of guests. The Boston elite poured into my foyer, draped in heavy designer coats and dripping with diamonds. They murmured quietly to one another, casting sharp, judgmental glances around the architecture. Beatrice stood at the center of the grand living room, wearing a striking emerald gown, greeting her guests with a wide, predatory smile. She looked like a spider welcoming flies into her web. She immediately directed their attention toward the lavish decor, loudly taking credit for every single detail, while subtly injecting toxic comments about my supposed lack of taste. I remained upstairs for the first hour, carefully monitoring the live surveillance feeds on my encrypted device. I watched Declan hovering near the wet bar, frantically downing his second glass of scotch to calm his visible tremors. He looked absolutely terrified of the impending confrontation. I smoothed the fabric of my tailored evening gown, checked my reflection in the hallway mirror, and took a deep breath. The stage was perfectly set. The audience had arrived. Beatrice was confidently waiting to execute her humiliating trap. I opened my bedroom door and began my slow, deliberate descent down the grand mahogany staircase, stepping directly into the glittering crossfire with absolute unwavering confidence. The rhythmic clicking of my heels against the mahogany staircase drew the attention of several guests near the foyer. I kept my posture straight, projecting complete control as I descended. The living room was a sea of glittering jewels, tailored suits, and the scent of high-end perfume. Waiters moved silently through the large crowd, offering flutes of champagne and silver trays, adorned with miniature delicacies. I recognized the faces of the Boston elite, people who had ignored me in coffee shops all week now drinking my wine on my hardwood floors. I offered polite smiles to those who dared make eye contact, but most looked away whispering behind manicured hands. Jamal stood near the fireplace swirling a glass of bourbon. He caught my eye and offered a respectful nod, aware a storm was brewing. Penelope stood across the room loudly complaining to a politician about the caterers, oblivious to the fact that the waiter pouring her drink was a security operative carrying a concealed radio. I scanned the room for my husband. Declan hovered near the towering Christmas tree, sweating profusely and gripping his glass so tightly his knuckles were white. He looked like a man walking to an execution. He refused to look at me, staring fixedly at the frosted pine branches. The roar of aristocratic chatter halted when a piercing sound echoed through the room. Beatrice was standing on the elevated landing, aggressively tapping a silver spoon against her champagne flute. She wore an expression of supreme triumph. The guests ceased their conversations, turning their attention toward the matriarch of the evening. Beatrice smoothed the front of her emerald gown and projected her voice to the back of the townhouse. She warmly thanked everyone for attending this holiday gathering, falsely claiming it was a cherished family tradition she had personally funded to celebrate the season. Then her predatory smile widened. She announced a special surprise for the evening. She dramatically gestured toward the heavy oak front doors. The doors swung open with theatrical timing, pulled back by one of my undercover security personnel. Stepping over the threshold was a woman dripping in ostentatious designer labels. It was Vanessa, the former girlfriend of Declan. Vanessa possessed a massive trust fund and an equally massive sense of entitlement. She strutted into my foyer wearing a stark white evening gown, looking entirely out of place but oozing with manufactured confidence. She locked eyes with Declan and offered a sickeningly sweet wave. A gasp rippled through the crowd of wealthy socialites. Bringing an ex-girlfriend to a holiday party was a catastrophic breach of etiquette. It was a declaration of absolute war. Beatrice walked down the short flight of stairs and linked her arm firmly through the arm of Vanessa. She paraded the woman into the center of the living room, stopping just a few feet away from where I stood. Beatrice turned to the crowd, her voice dripping with venom. She declared that it broke her heart to bring such personal matters to light, but she could not allow her brilliant son to suffer for another day. Beatrice pointed a shaking finger at my chest. She proclaimed to the room that Declan was trapped in a fraudulent marriage. She accused me of being a ruthless thief. She spun her fabricated narrative with conviction, telling the audience that I had systematically drained the financial accounts of Declan, embezzled his non-existent fortune, and utilized a shell company to steal the roof over their heads. She called me a con artist who preyed on the generous nature of her family. The guests stared at me in horrified fascination, drinking in every drop of the toxic poison Beatrice was pouring. But Beatrice was not finished. She pulled Vanessa forward, presenting her like a grand prize to the captivated audience. Beatrice loudly announced that, unlike the deceitful criminal standing before them, Vanessa was a woman of true pedigree, immense wealth, and genuine loyalty. Beatrice proudly declared that Vanessa had graciously offered to bail Declan out of the financial ruin I had supposedly caused him. The proposition was laid bare for everyone to hear. Vanessa would pay off all the debts of Declan, fund his future, and restore his rightful place in society, but only under one strict condition. Declan had to immediately file for a divorce, kick me out into the freezing winter night, and sever all ties with the woman who ruined his life. The silence that followed was absolute and suffocating. Every single eye in the room pivoted away from Beatrice and landed squarely on Declan. The entire assembly of the Boston upper crust waited with bated breath to see how the supposed victim would respond to this heroic rescue mission. Declan stood frozen near the Christmas tree. His face was a sickly shade of gray. He looked at his mother, then at the wealthy ex-girlfriend offering him a financial lifeline, and finally at me. I stood my ground, my posture perfectly straight, my expression entirely unreadable. I waited for him to speak. I waited for my husband of 1 week to find a single shred of dignity, to defend his wife against this deranged public humiliation, or to at least admit the truth about his own empty bank accounts. Declan simply lowered his head. He stared down at the polished hardwood floor and said absolutely nothing. He did not defend me. He did not object to the sudden presence of his former girlfriend. He did not deny the vicious accusations his mother had just hurled at me in front of 50 prominent guests. By remaining completely silent, he cowardly validated every single word Beatrice had spoken. He enabled the humiliation, hoping that selling me out would somehow magically solve his crushing debts. He had made his final choice. He threw me directly to the hungry wolves, utterly unaware that I owned the entire pack. I took a slow, deep breath, maintaining my calm facade, knowing that the time for observation had officially ended. I stepped forward, my tailored evening gown brushing against the polished hardwood floor. I did not raise my voice, nor did I shed a single tear. I offered a chilling, perfectly composed smile that caused the immediate atmosphere in the room to shift. Beatrice paused, her triumphant sneer faltering for just a fraction of a second as she tried to comprehend my absolute lack of panic. I walked directly past Vanessa, the supposedly wealthy savior, who was currently clinging to Declan like a prized trophy. I moved toward the massive 85-inch smart television mounted securely above the grand marble fireplace. Beatrice scoffed loudly, attempting to regain control of her malicious narrative. She told the crowd that I was clearly in shock and probably trying to find a way to beg for forgiveness. She urged Declan to stand strong against my impending manipulation. I completely ignored her toxic rambling. I pulled my encrypted smartphone from my evening clutch and tapped the screen exactly 3 times. The massive television screen behind me instantly flared to life. A few guests murmured, expecting to see a humiliating financial document or perhaps a desperate plea. Instead, the screen displayed a pristine high-definition security feed. The timestamp in the corner indicated the footage was recorded just a few days prior. On the exact afternoon, my vintage silver car disappeared from the cobblestone driveway. The camera angle provided a flawless, brightly lit view of the interior garage. I pressed play. The state-of-the-art hidden microphones captured the audio with devastating clarity, broadcasting every single word through the premium surround sound speakers installed throughout the living room. On the massive screen, Beatrice and Declan stepped into the empty garage bay. They were not arguing, they were laughing hysterically. The towering television amplified the sound of my husband mocking me behind my back. Beatrice clapped her hands together in sheer delight, praising Declan for his absolute brilliance. She loudly congratulated him on successfully taking the title of my car to a shady pawnbroker. She bragged about using the cash to finally pay off the aggressive debt collectors from her underground poker games. The entire holiday party fell dead silent. The wealthy socialites, the elite politicians, and the arrogant country club members stopped breathing. The crystal champagne flutes hovered motionless in their hands. The video continued playing, delivering an even more catastrophic blow to their fabricated reality. Declan leaned against the garage wall, wiping a tear of laughter from his eye. He loudly declared that the post-nuptial agreement was the greatest trap they had ever set. He told his mother that as soon as the holiday party was over, they would use the legal clauses to drain every single penny out of my measly furniture appraisal business. Beatrice agreed enthusiastically. She instructed him to max out my personal credit lines and then toss me out into the freezing winter streets with absolutely nothing. Declan smirked right into the hidden camera lens, calling me completely gullible, naive, and blindingly stupid. He bragged that I genuinely believed he loved me, making it incredibly easy to rob me blind. I paused the video right on a freeze frame of Declan wearing a greedy, sinister, and incredibly pathetic smile. The silence in the grand living room was absolute and suffocating. The elite guests stared at the frozen image on the screen, and then slowly, collectively turned their horrified gazes toward Beatrice and Declan. The narrative had violently flipped. The high society crowd realized instantly that they were not standing in the presence of a heroic mother protecting her wealthy son from a scheming gold digger. They realized they were actively drinking champagne with two desperate broke and malicious criminals who had just enthusiastically confessed to grand larceny, vehicular theft, and premeditated financial fraud on a high-definition recording. Vanessa, the haughty heiress who had marched into my foyer acting like a conquering queen, suddenly looked incredibly pale. She stared at the 85-inch television screen, her mouth hanging completely open. She was wealthy, entitled, and arrogant, but she was not entirely stupid. She recognized a massive legal and social landmine when she saw one. The reality of the situation crashed down upon her. Declan was not a wealthy victim needing rescue. He was a broke, desperate thief attempting to use her bank account to save himself from impending criminal charges. Vanessa slowly removed her hand from the arm of Declan. She took a deliberate step backward, creating immediate physical distance between herself and the sinking ship. Declan reached out for her, his face a mask of sheer panic, begging her to stay and listen to his explanation. He stammered that the video was taken out of context. Vanessa looked at him with profound, unfiltered disgust. She did not say a single word to defend him or Beatrice. She simply turned around, her white evening gown sweeping across the floor, and rapidly walked straight back out the heavy oak front doors, abandoning Declan entirely to the catastrophic mess he had created. Beatrice began to hyperventilate. Her chest heaved as she desperately tried to formulate a cohesive defense. She pointed a shaking finger at the television and shrieked that the footage was heavily doctored. She yelled to the silent room that I had hired computer hackers to manipulate their voices and ruin their sterling reputation. She demanded that someone call the authorities to arrest me for digital espionage. I stood my ground, holding my encrypted phone, my posture radiating absolute control. I looked at the horrified faces of the Boston elite, who were currently mentally calculating how fast they could escape this toxic environment without becoming implicated in the scandal. Declan fell to his knees on the hardwood floor, clutching his head in his hands, finally realizing that his entire life was completely over. The trap that Beatrice had designed to publicly destroy me had just successfully broadcast their own ultimate ruin. Beatrice refused to accept the catastrophic reality unfolding in front of the Boston elite. She stepped away from the massive television screen, her emerald gown catching the light as she wildly waved her arms. She screamed that the footage was an elaborate fabrication. Her voice was shrill, echoing off the high ceilings, as she desperately accused me of hiring digital counterfeiters to construct a malicious deepfake. She pointed a trembling finger at the frozen image of her son, demanding that the remaining guests recognize the obvious manipulation. She insisted that her wealthy, successful boy would never steal a car or plot to embezzle money from a lowly furniture appraiser. Her frantic denials only cemented her guilt in the eyes of the sophisticated crowd. Nobody moved to support her. Nobody offered a single word of comfort. They simply watched her unravel, utterly disgusted by her brazen attempts to insult their intelligence. Declan remained on his knees, paralyzed by the sheer weight of his public exposure. He looked up at his mother, his eyes wide and hollow, silently begging her to stop making the situation worse. But Beatrice possessed zero self-awareness. She continued her manic tirade, threatening to sue me for defamation of character and emotional distress. She yelled that she would contact the police to report my blatant cybercrimes. That was the precise moment Jamal decided he had heard enough. He set his crystal bourbon glass on the nearest mahogany side table with a sharp, resonant thud. The brilliant corporate lawyer stepped out from the shadows near the fireplace. His posture was impeccable, projecting absolute, unshakable authority. He walked directly into the center of the grand living room, positioning himself between Beatrice and the horrified guests. He did not yell. He did not match the frantic, hysterical energy of my mother-in-law. He spoke with the cold, measured, and devastatingly precise tone of a senior attorney delivering a closing argument that would guarantee a guilty verdict. Jamal looked directly at Beatrice and told her to close her mouth before she incriminated herself any further. He stated that as a licensed attorney, he felt morally obligated to inform her that continuing to speak would only expedite her impending prison sentence. Beatrice gasped, deeply offended that her own son-in-law would dare speak to her with such unyielding disrespect. She demanded that he defend his family. Jamal let out a sharp, humorless laugh. He announced to the entire room that he was defending his family, which is exactly why he was publicly severing ties with her right now. He pivoted slightly, addressing both Beatrice and the kneeling Declan. He began to systematically dissect the legal implications of the security footage we had all just watched. He listed their crimes with ruthless efficiency. First, Jamal highlighted the theft of the vintage silver vehicle. He explained that knowingly taking a luxury asset that belonged to a separate legal entity, regardless of the marital status of the individuals involved, constituted grand larceny. He noted that the value of the vehicle elevated the crime to a severe felony. Second, he dismantled their boastful conversation about pawning the title to cover illicit gambling debts. He pointed out that presenting fraudulent ownership documents to a lending institution constituted bank fraud and wire fraud. Third, he addressed their specific premeditated plan to leverage the post-nuptial agreement to drain my personal business accounts. He identified this as a textbook example of criminal conspiracy to commit financial fraud. Jamal did not stop there. He reminded Beatrice that the state takes a remarkably dim view of individuals who attempt to manipulate the legal system for malicious financial gain. He stated that the high-definition video complete with crystal-clear audio of their enthusiastic confessions was a prosecutor's ultimate dream. He told Declan that any competent district attorney would use that specific footage to secure maximum sentences for both of them. He casually mentioned that the sheer arrogance they displayed on camera would ensure that no judge would ever grant them leniency. Declan let out a pathetic whimper, burying his face in his hands. He finally understood the gravity of his actions. Beatrice, however, remained violently stubborn. She glared at Jamal, her chest heaving, and spat out that he was a traitor. She accused him of turning against his own blood out of sheer spite. Jamal did not flinch. His expression remained utterly stoic as he turned his back on Beatrice entirely. He walked over to where his wife Penelope was standing near the grand staircase. Penelope looked completely shattered. Her face was pale and her eyes darted between her husband, her mother, and her brother. She had spent her entire life seeking the approval of Beatrice, blindly following her mother's toxic lead, and eagerly participating in the mockery of anyone deemed beneath their manufactured social standing. Now the foundation of her entire reality had been ripped away, exposing the ugly criminal truth underneath. Jamal reached out and gently took Penelope by the shoulders. He looked her directly in the eyes, his voice softening just a fraction, but maintaining its absolute firmness. He told his wife that her mother and brother were massive toxic liabilities. He warned her that Beatrice and Declan were standing on the deck of a rapidly sinking ship, and they would not hesitate to drag her down into the dark, freezing water with them just to save themselves. Jamal explicitly stated that their reckless criminal behavior and staggering financial debts would eventually bleed into her life if she did not cut the cord immediately. He reminded Penelope of the times she co-signed suspicious documents for her mother, acting as a blind guarantor for loans she never truly understood. He warned her that the fallout from this spectacular public collapse would trigger a massive financial audit, ruining anyone associated with Beatrice. Jamal told his wife she had exactly one chance to walk away clean, abandon the fraudulent empire her mother built, and save her own future. The mass exodus of the Boston elite happened with breathtaking speed. The moment Jamal finished delivering his devastating legal assessment, the grand living room transformed into a chaotic scramble for the exit. Wealthy socialites who had spent the entire evening sipping my champagne and whispering malicious gossip about my character now could not get out of my townhouse fast enough. They shoved past one another, abandoning half-empty crystal flutes on the velvet furniture and grabbing their heavy designer coats from the coat check without waiting for the attendants. Nobody wanted to be in the same room as two people who had just enthusiastically confessed to multiple felonies on a high-definition screen. The silence of their departure was absolute. There were no polite farewells. There were no promises to call. The high society crowd simply evaporated into the freezing winter night, leaving behind a glittering empty shell of a holiday gala. I remained standing near the fireplace watching the grand oak doors close behind the final fleeing guest. My undercover security operatives moved seamlessly through the space, quietly clearing the abandoned glasses and maintaining an invisible perimeter. The trap had sprung flawlessly. Beatrice and Declan, unable to withstand the sheer humiliation of the silent evacuation, had retreated into the spacious kitchen. They huddled together near the marble island, like cornered animals. Penelope stood frozen at the base of the staircase, her face pale and her eyes wide with mounting horror. The words Jamal had just spoken about toxic liabilities and blind guarantors echoed heavily in the quiet foyer. Penelope looked at her husband. Jamal offered her a steady, reassuring nod, silently urging her to finally confront the reality she had spent 36 years aggressively avoiding. Penelope took a deep breath, her shoulders trembling slightly beneath her expensive silk dress. She turned and marched directly toward the kitchen. Jamal walked closely behind her, a silent, immovable pillar of legal and emotional support. I followed at a discreet distance, leaning against the archway to observe the final collapse of their family dynamic. Penelope stepped into the kitchen and demanded answers. She looked her mother right in the eye and asked for a complete, honest explanation regarding the financial documents she had been pressured into signing over the past 6 months. Beatrice scoffed, attempting to maintain her usual overbearing authority. She waved her manicured hand dismissively, telling Penelope to lower her voice and stop acting like a hysterical child. Beatrice claimed the documents were standard business forms required to secure commercial real estate for her luxury spa venture. She insisted everything was perfectly legal and under control. Jamal stepped forward, placing a protective hand on the shoulder of his wife. He informed his mother-in-law that nothing about her current situation was under control. He reminded Beatrice that the bank had already rejected Declan for a second mortgage because Declan did not own the property. Jamal then asked a very pointed, devastating question. If the bank rejected the primary collateral, how exactly did Beatrice secure the massive commercial loan required for her extravagant downtown spa? Beatrice stammered, her eyes darting nervously between Jamal and Penelope. She puffed out her chest, aggressively stating that she had utilized her excellent credit and stellar reputation to secure private financing. Penelope shook her head, her voice rising in sudden frantic panic. She yelled that she knew her mother had terrible credit because she had bailed Beatrice out of country club debts twice before. Penelope demanded to know whose financial profile was actually attached to the commercial spa loan. Declan, still sweating profusely and entirely incapable of keeping his mouth shut under pressure, interjected with a pathetic attempt at justification. He told his sister to calm down, whining that they were a family, and families shared their resources. He casually stated that they just needed a clean financial profile to push the application through the underwriting department. He muttered that they fully intended to pay her back as soon as the luxury spa became profitable. The air in the kitchen grew absolutely still. Penelope stared at her younger brother, her mouth hanging completely open. She turned her horrified gaze back to her mother. Beatrice crossed her arms defensively, letting the fatal truth slip from her lips, with a staggering lack of remorse. Beatrice arrogantly declared that she had simply used the social security number of Penelope to finalize the primary loan application. She claimed she was entitled to do so because she was the matriarch of the family and had sacrificed everything to raise her children. Beatrice proudly admitted that she had forged the signature of Penelope on the final commercial contracts, insisting it was a minor administrative shortcut taken for the greater good of their family legacy. Penelope physically recoiled, staggering backward as if she had just been struck. The magnitude of the betrayal crashed down upon her. Her own mother had committed deliberate, calculated identity theft against her. Beatrice had anchored a massive, high-risk commercial loan to the pristine financial record of Penelope, effectively chaining her daughter to a sinking ship of debt without her knowledge or consent. Penelope looked at the woman she had blindly defended her entire life. The veil of manipulation finally shattered. She saw Beatrice not as a sophisticated society matriarch, but as a desperate, malicious parasite willing to destroy her own children to fund her delusions of grandeur. She saw Declan not as a successful finance executive, but as a weak, enabling coward who happily participated in the financial ruin of his own sister. Penelope found her voice. It did not tremble. It rang out with absolute icy clarity. She told Beatrice that she was a monster. She looked at Declan and called him a pathetic fraud. Penelope announced to the quiet kitchen that she was officially done. She declared that she would not spend another second of her life catering to their toxic demands, covering their embarrassing mistakes, or paying for their crimes. She walked out. The heavy oak doors slammed shut behind Penelope. The sound echoed through the grand foyer with profound finality. Declan remained frozen in the kitchen. He stared at the empty space where his sister had just stood. The protective shield his family always provided was disintegrating. Beatrice stumbled backward against the marble island. She gasped for air, clutching her emerald gown. She muttered frantic excuses, trying to spin the narrative, insisting Penelope was simply emotional and would eventually return to beg for forgiveness. Declan did not listen to her toxic rambling. A suffocating wave of panic crashed over him. The reality of his situation was no longer a distant threat. It was an immediate, crushing crisis. He had no access to the premium credit cards. The bank had flagged him for mortgage fraud. His sister had severed all ties, taking her pristine credit score with her. The illegal pawnshop loan against my vintage car would soon default. Ruthless debt collectors from the underground poker games would be looking for their money. Declan realized he needed cash immediately, or he would face total ruin. He ignored his mother, grabbed his winter coat, and rushed out the back door into the freezing night. Declan spent the weekend spiraling in a cheap motel, hiding from me and his creditors. He ignored frantic calls from Beatrice. By Monday morning, he formulated a desperate plan. He dressed in his sharpest suit, attempting to project his usual aura of arrogant success. He drove to the sleek downtown building that housed his finance firm. He intended to march into the office of his managing director, invent a story about a liquidity issue, and demand an emergency salary advance. If that failed, he planned to liquidate his entire retirement portfolio, regardless of early withdrawal penalties. He believed his status as a finance executive would grant him the leverage to secure a lifeline. He strode through the revolving glass doors, expecting the usual morning routine. Instead, he walked into absolute chaos. The atmosphere in the building was thick with anxiety. The familiar front desk receptionists were gone, replaced by stern security personnel wearing unfamiliar corporate badges. Junior analysts and senior brokers stood in nervous groups near the elevators, whispering frantically. Declan pushed his way through the crowd and swiped his badge at the turnstile. The digital reader flashed a bright, angry red. Access denied. He scowled, assuming it was a simple system error. He motioned for a security guard to manually override the gate. The guard did not move. He simply stared at Declan with a cold, detached expression. A woman in a sharp charcoal suit approached the turnstiles from the interior lobby. She carried a thick digital tablet and wore an identification lanyard bearing the logo of a massive multinational corporate conglomerate. Declan recognized the logo immediately. It was the apex predator of the financial sector, a colossal empire that consumed regional firms and stripped them down for parts. The woman introduced herself as a senior compliance director for the new parent company. She announced loudly enough for the surrounding employees to hear that over the weekend, the firm had been aggressively acquired in a hostile all-cash corporate buyout. The original executive board had been entirely ousted. The new ownership had immediately locked down all internal systems, frozen all trading floors, and initiated a ruthless zero-tolerance institutional audit of every single employee. Declan felt the blood drain from his face. His plan to secure a quiet, under-the-table salary advance evaporated instantly. The compliance director instructed the security guards to escort Declan, not to his corner office, but directly to a windowless interrogation room on the ground floor. He was marched past his staring colleagues, stripped of his dignity, before he even knew what hit him. Inside the bleak room, 2 more corporate auditors were waiting. They did not offer him a seat. They did not offer him a cup of coffee. They opened a thick physical dossier and placed it squarely on the metal table. The lead auditor looked Declan right in the eye and delivered the fatal blow. He stated that the new corporate ownership mandated a rigorous risk assessment profile for all personnel to ensure absolute financial integrity. Declan had failed this assessment spectacularly. The auditor began listing the catastrophic red flags that had triggered immediate internal alarms. First, they highlighted a recent, massive inquiry from a major banking institution regarding a deeply fraudulent secondary mortgage application. Second, they pointed out the sudden, highly suspicious freezing of 4 premium credit accounts associated with his name. Third, they revealed an alarming pattern of unsecured personal debt directly tied to known illicit gambling syndicates. The auditors had uncovered the toxic financial web his mother had dragged him into. Declan opened his mouth to defend himself. He tried to deploy his usual arrogant charm. He stammered that there was a simple misunderstanding, a minor error regarding his residential property. He tried to claim that the debt belonged to a family member and that his personal finances were completely secure. The auditors did not even blink. They operated with lethal precision. They informed Declan that attempting to commit bank fraud by mortgaging a property he did not legally own was not an error. It was a severe felony that posed a massive liability to their newly acquired corporate asset. The compliance director stepped forward and delivered the final verdict. She stated that due to his extreme financial mismanagement and blatant violations of their strict corporate ethics policy, his employment was immediately suspended pending a full investigation. He would receive no severance. He would receive no salary advance. His retirement accounts were permanently frozen. Security officers stepped forward demanding he surrender his phone and keys. Declan was marched straight out the front doors. He was left standing alone on the freezing Boston sidewalk, completely stripped of his job, his income, and his false prestige, unaware that the hand directing this corporate slaughter belonged to his own wife. Declan stood on the freezing concrete pavement outside the towering glass building of his former employer. The bitter wind whipped through his expensive wool coat, chilling him to the bone. He held a small cardboard box containing a handful of worthless personal items from his desk. His phone vibrated in his pocket. It was his mother. He answered with trembling hands, barely able to articulate the sheer magnitude of his absolute failure. He confessed that his firm had been aggressively acquired, and he was officially suspended without pay. Beatrice shrieked through the receiver, demanding he immediately meet her at a cheap diner on the outskirts of the city. She had maxed out her final line of credit and could no longer afford the private club. Declan arrived at the greasy diner 20 minutes later, sliding into a cracked vinyl booth across from his mother. The reality of total financial ruin stared them right in the face. Beatrice refused to accept defeat. She furiously stirred her black coffee, her mind churning with malicious desperation. She told Declan they needed to strike back immediately before the creditors realized they were completely broke. Her eyes gleamed with a toxic, dangerous idea. Beatrice leaned across the sticky diner table and lowered her voice to a harsh whisper. She commanded Declan to focus entirely on the Boston townhouse. She refused to accept that a faceless corporation owned the multi-million-dollar property. In her deeply delusional mind, she remained convinced that the freelance furniture appraiser she despised had simply orchestrated a complex scam to steal all his rightful assets. Beatrice theorized that if they could physically remove their enemy from the property, they could quickly move in and claim squatters' rights. She boldly claimed that possession was 9/10 of the law. If they occupied the massive townhouse, they could legally stall the bank, block any impending foreclosure, and force the mysterious holding company to pay them a massive cash settlement just to vacate the premises. It was a wildly illegal and profoundly stupid strategy, but Declan was drowning in panic. He eagerly grasped at the toxic lifeline his mother presented. He asked her how they could possibly force a stubborn woman to leave her own home without triggering a massive police response. Beatrice smiled a predatory, wicked smile. She pulled a notepad from her designer handbag and slammed it onto the table. Beatrice declared they would forge an official eviction notice. She reasoned that a woman who spent her days moving old chairs around would possess absolutely zero understanding of complex property law or tenant rights. Beatrice was absolutely certain the terrifying threat of imminent arrest would force her out into the freezing night without a fight. They spent the next 2 hours huddled in the dingy booth crafting a fraudulent legal document. Declan used his phone to search for official state eviction templates, haphazardly copying the aggressive legal jargon. Beatrice dictated the terms, filling the document with terrifying threats of immediate police intervention, asset seizure, and severe criminal prosecution for trespassing on private property. They drove to a nearby public library, paid 50 cents to use the communal printer, and produced the fake document. They even forged the signature of a fictional municipal judge to make the threat appear entirely legitimate. Declan held the freshly printed paper in his shaking hands. He genuinely believed this piece of forged trash was the ultimate key to his financial salvation. He was entirely blind to the fact that he was committing yet another easily provable felony. Night had completely fallen over Boston by the time they drove back to the upscale neighborhood. The street lamps cast long, sharp shadows across the cobblestones. Declan parked his car 2 blocks away to avoid detection. He and Beatrice walked briskly through the biting cold, their heavy coats wrapped tightly against the winter wind. They approached the grand townhouse with the stealth of amateur thieves. The large bay windows were dark, save for a single warm light glowing from the second-floor study. Beatrice pointed toward the heavy oak front door, shoving the forged document into the chest of her son. She ordered him to execute the final phase of their desperate operation. Declan crept up the stone steps, his heart hammering wildly against his ribs. He knelt on the freezing porch, folded the fraudulent eviction notice perfectly in half, and slid it directly under the solid oak door. He stood up, taking a deep breath to manufacture a sense of absolute authority. He pounded his fist against the heavy wood 3 times, the loud noise echoing sharply down the quiet residential street. He stepped back and yelled at the top of his lungs. Declan shouted through the thick door, demanding that the property be vacated by morning. He aggressively declared that he possessed a court-ordered eviction mandate and would not hesitate to involve law enforcement if the premises were not entirely empty by sunrise. He warned that any resistance would result in immediate arrest. Beatrice stood behind him on the sidewalk, nodding with fierce satisfaction. They turned and rushed away into the dark night, completely convinced they had just executed a masterful legal ambush. Inside the warm, silent townhouse, I sat comfortably in my plush armchair, sipping a cup of chamomile tea. I heard the frantic pounding on the door and the pathetic, desperate shouting of my estranged husband. I set my teacup down, walked downstairs, and picked up the folded piece of paper from the marble foyer floor. I unfolded the document and read the aggressive, poorly formatted legal jargon. A genuine smile spread across my face. They had actually delivered physical documented proof of their criminal extortion directly into my hands. I did not panic. I did not pack a single bag or shed a solitary tear over this. I simply picked up my encrypted phone, dialed my lead attorney, and told him it was time to prepare the ultimate legal trap for our final devastating strike. I remained standing in the foyer holding the forged eviction document. I placed my encrypted smartphone to my ear. My counsel answered on the second ring. I instructed him to mobilize the elite litigation unit. We had physical documentation of felony extortion. I demanded that Jamal lead the confrontation. I called Jamal directly. He answered with the sharp tone of a man preparing for battle. I formally offered him the position of lead counsel for Vanguard Holdings, retaining him with a massive fee. Jamal accepted enthusiastically. He stated he would be delighted to personally dismantle the fraudulent empire his mother-in-law attempted to build. He promised to be at my townhouse before sunrise with 3 incredibly vicious litigators. I did not pack a box. I spent the rest of the night preparing my living room for the impending legal slaughter. I arranged the heavy mahogany chairs in an imposing semicircle facing the foyer. I laid out the verified property deeds alongside the mountain of financial evidence we had gathered. I showered and selected a flawless tailored navy blue power suit. I wanted to look exactly like the billionaire executive I actually was. I walked downstairs just as the sun began to rise. Jamal arrived on time, flanked by 3 incredibly intimidating corporate attorneys, carrying thick briefcases. We sat in perfect silence, waiting for the fools to arrive. At precisely 9 o'clock in the freezing morning, a noisy commercial van pulled up outside my townhouse. I watched through the bay window as a tired-looking locksmith stepped out carrying a heavy tool bag. A cheap rideshare vehicle parked behind the van. Declan and Beatrice climbed out onto the freezing sidewalk. They lacked their usual luxury transportation, but carried themselves with an absurd swagger. Beatrice wore her emerald green winter coat, looking like a conquering general. Declan strutted behind her, rubbing his hands together in the bitter cold. They genuinely believed their pathetic forged document had terrified me into fleeing. Beatrice marched up the stone steps, pointing aggressively at the heavy oak front door. She barked orders at the confused locksmith, demanding that he drill out the main cylinder immediately. She loudly complained about the freezing temperature and told the man to hurry up. Declan stood on the top step, grinning like a triumphant victor. He arrogantly told the locksmith that his ex-wife had been legally evicted and they needed to secure the asset before she tried to return. The locksmith nodded, pulled a power drill from his canvas bag, and stepped up to the thick wooden door. Before the sharp metal drill bit could even touch the solid brass lock, I reached out and turned the interior handle. I pulled the heavy oak door completely open, stepping back to reveal the imposing fortress I had constructed inside my foyer. Declan froze. His victorious grin evaporated in a fraction of a second. Beatrice let out a sharp gasp, stumbling backward and nearly knocking the locksmith down the stone steps. They had truly expected an empty house or a weeping woman begging for a few more hours to pack her bags. Instead, they found me standing tall, wearing a designer suit that cost more than their entire remaining net worth. I looked down at them with an expression of absolute freezing contempt. Beatrice opened her mouth to scream her usual toxic demands, but the words died in her throat. Stepping out from the shadows of the grand foyer, moving to stand directly by my right side, was Jamal. The brilliant black corporate lawyer wore a custom-tailored gray suit, holding the forged eviction notice in his hands. Behind him, standing in a perfect, intimidating line, were three of the most expensive, ruthless corporate litigators in the state. Declan stared at his brother-in-law, his jaw hanging completely unhinged. He stammered helplessly, desperately asking Jamal what he was doing standing inside this house. Beatrice clutched her emerald coat, her eyes darting frantically between the army of lawyers and my composed face. She demanded to know why Penelope was not there, foolishly attempting to invoke a family loyalty that no longer existed. Jamal stepped boldly over the threshold, towering over Declan and Beatrice. His tone cut through the freezing morning air like a sharpened razor. He officially introduced himself as the lead corporate counsel for Vanguard Holdings LLC, the sole and legal owner of the property they were currently attempting to invade. Jamal gestured smoothly to the three elite attorneys standing behind him, introducing them as specialists in criminal extortion, real estate fraud, and corporate litigation. Jamal looked directly into the terrified eyes of Beatrice. He held up the crumpled, poorly forged eviction notice. He stated clearly that presenting a fabricated legal document with the intent to force a lawful occupant out of their private property constituted felony extortion and malicious trespass. He informed the trembling locksmith that the people who hired him had zero legal right to the property and advised the man to leave the premises immediately to avoid being named as an accessory to breaking and entering. The locksmith took one look at the terrifying wall of expensive lawyers, grabbed his power drill, and sprinted back to his commercial van without a single word. He sped quickly away, leaving Beatrice and Declan entirely exposed on my front porch. Declan took a small, pathetic step backward, his hands shaking wildly in the winter wind. He looked at Jamal and begged for an explanation, whining that they were family and that Jamal was supposed to be on their side. Jamal offered a cold, merciless smile. He stated that his only loyalty was to the law and to his highly valued client. He ordered Declan and Beatrice to step inside the house, warning them that the final discussion regarding their catastrophic legal future would not happen on a public sidewalk. He told them the trap was officially closed, and it was time to assess the absolute ruin they had brought upon themselves. Declan and Beatrice stumbled over the threshold, their previous bravado entirely shattered. They walked into my grand living room, like prisoners being marched toward a firing squad. The three elite corporate litigators filed in silently behind them, effectively blocking the only exit. Jamal directed the trembling mother and son toward the center of the room, forcing them to stand directly in front of the heavy mahogany coffee table I had prepared earlier. I remained seated in my plush velvet armchair, my posture radiating the absolute power they had so foolishly tried to steal. I gestured toward the thick leather-bound folders resting on the polished wood. I kept my voice terrifyingly calm, completely devoid of any anger or sorrow. I told them to look very closely at the documents they had tried so desperately to bypass. Beatrice crossed her arms over her emerald winter coat, her chest heaving with manufactured indignation. She attempted one final pathetic display of dominance, demanding to know how a broke freelance furniture appraiser managed to hire such an expensive legal team. She insisted I was just running another elaborate con. I did not argue with her. I simply leaned forward and flipped open the first leather folder. I slid the certified watermarked property deed across the mahogany table. I told her to read the registered ownership details out loud. Beatrice squinted at the page, her face twisting in profound confusion as she read the name Vanguard Holdings LLC. She snapped that this proved her point entirely, claiming I had been evicted by a legitimate corporate entity. Jamal let out a sharp, humorless laugh. He stepped forward and tapped a secondary document attached to the deed. He informed Beatrice that she was currently standing in the physical presence of the sole founder, managing director, and primary shareholder of Vanguard Holdings. I watched the realization. Beatrice like a physical blow. Her jaw dropped. I stated clearly that the townhouse had never belonged to Declan. I purchased it outright with cash through my private company 3 months before our wedding. I allowed Declan to pay a fraction of the market rent simply to protect his incredibly fragile ego. The house was always mine, the luxury cars were always mine, and the very floor they were standing on belonged exclusively to me. Declan began to hyperventilate. He clutched his chest, shaking his head in frantic denial. He stammered that this made absolutely no sense, whining that I was just a woman who moved old chairs around. I corrected him instantly. I told him my boutique art consulting firm was simply a convenient low-profile shell designed to manage massive international asset valuations without drawing unwanted public attention. Then I opened the second leather folder. I slid a stack of heavily redacted corporate acquisition contracts toward him. I asked Declan if he enjoyed his morning visit to his former finance firm. I asked him if he enjoyed meeting the compliance director from the massive corporate conglomerate that had just aggressively acquired his employer. Declan turned a sickly shade of gray, his eyes wide with absolute unadulterated terror. He looked at me, then at the acquisition documents, his brain desperately trying to reject the impossible math. I smiled, offering a cold and predatory expression. I informed my treacherous husband that the hostile corporate takeover that resulted in his immediate suspension was not a coincidence. I told him that my private holding company, utilizing a vast network of proxy corporations, was the exact entity that purchased his entire firm. I bought the company he worked for specifically to initiate the ruthless internal audit that uncovered his massive gambling debts and his pathetic attempt at mortgage fraud. I had not just locked him out of my house. I had legally and systematically dismantled his entire professional existence. Beatrice let out a high-pitched, strangled gasp. Her legs gave way, and she collapsed heavily onto the nearest velvet sofa, completely unable to support her own weight. She looked at me as if I had suddenly transformed into a terrifying mythological creature. Declan stood, frozen, tears of sheer panic welling in his eyes. He choked out a pathetic whisper, asking how any of this was financially possible. He begged to know where the money came from. I reached for the third and final leather folder. I opened it with slow, deliberate precision. I pulled out a certified, unredacted financial statement from the most exclusive wealth management institution in the country. I placed it directly in front of him. I told Declan that my father was a highly decorated 4-star general who spent decades building a massive, untouchable empire in defense contracting and international logistics. Before he passed away, my father taught me how to recognize parasites who only valued status and money. I informed Declan that I was the sole uncontested heir to that empire. The financial statement displayed a verified liquid net worth of exactly $90 million. The astronomical number seemed to drain the remaining oxygen from the room. Declan stared at the terrifying string of zeros, his mind completely breaking under the immense weight of his catastrophic failure. He realized in that exact moment that he had thrown away a lifetime of unimaginable wealth and absolute security just to impress his toxic gambling-addicted mother and secure a few $1,000s in petty pawnshop loans. He had tried to steal pennies from a woman who owned the entire bank. The sheer magnitude of his monumental stupidity crushed him. Declan let out a ragged, agonizing sob. His knees buckled entirely. He dropped straight down onto the hardwood floor, landing heavily on his knees right in front of the mahogany table. He bowed his head openly, weeping as the absolute devastating ruin he had brought upon himself finally crushed his spirit. Beatrice slid off the velvet sofa, joining her son on the floor in a pathetic heap of emerald fabric and shattered delusions. They knelt before me in sheer, unadulterated shock, completely destroyed by the massive empire they had so arrogantly underestimated. Beatrice remained crumpled on the hardwood floor. Her designer emerald coat pooled around her like a deflated parachute. She stared at the $90 million figure on the financial statement, her mind completely shattered by the absolute reality of her catastrophic miscalculation. Declan knelt beside her, weeping openly, his face buried in his hands, as the sheer weight of his ruined existence crashed down upon him. The three elite corporate litigators stood silently behind them, effectively blocking any chance of escape. Jamal remained standing by my side, projecting absolute legal authority. Beatrice slowly looked up at me, her eyes wide with a pathetic, desperate realization. She understood that her country club gossip, her forged eviction notices, and her manipulative schemes were utterly meaningless against the monumental power of a $90 million empire. The arrogant, toxic matriarch, who had spent the entire morning demanding my immediate removal, was now reduced to a whimpering, terrified shell. She scrambled forward on her knees, desperately reaching out toward the heavy mahogany coffee table. She clasped her hands tightly together, her voice cracking as she began to plead for absolute mercy. She wept frantically, insisting that we were all family, and that families must always forgive each other's terrible mistakes. She cried that she was simply trying to protect her beloved son, claiming her actions were driven entirely by misguided maternal instinct rather than malicious greed. She begged me to find it in my heart to overlook the forged eviction notice, the stolen vintage car, and the relentless public humiliation she had engineered. She promised she would publicly retract every single vicious rumor she had spread among the Boston elite. I watched her pathetic performance with absolute freezing silence. I did not offer a single word of comfort. I did not extend a hand to help her up from the floor. I simply let her beg, savoring the absolute destruction of her manufactured reality. I leaned forward in my plush velvet armchair and reached for the first leather folder. I slid the documents aside, revealing the very first piece of paperwork she had aggressively slammed onto my kitchen island exactly 1 week after my wedding. It was the strict post-nuptial agreement. The same document Beatrice had wielded like a weapon, entirely convinced she was locking me out of a non-existent fortune. I picked up the post-nuptial agreement and held it up for Beatrice and Declan to see. I reminded them of the glorious morning they ambushed me in my own home. I reminded them of the sleazy attorney they had hired to threaten me with immediate annulment if I refused to sign. I reminded Declan of his cowardly silence, how he sat at the kitchen island and allowed his mother to paint me as a desperate gold-digging opportunist. I told them that I had signed the document without a single moment of hesitation because I had absolutely nothing to hide. But more importantly, I signed it because my wealth manager, anticipating their exact brand of toxic greed, had carefully reviewed the initial drafts long before the wedding day. I flipped to the third page of the dense legal document and placed my finger on a very specific, heavily bolded paragraph. I told Jamal to read the clause out loud for the room to hear. Jamal stepped forward, clearing his throat, and read the legal text with devastating, razor-sharp clarity. The clause explicitly stated that in the event of proven financial infidelity, deliberate asset theft, or any documented attempt to commit fraud against either spouse, the offending party would instantly forfeit any and all claims to marital assets. Furthermore, the clause mandated that the offending party would be left solely and completely responsible for their individual debts, liabilities, and legal fees, with zero recourse for financial support or alimony from the other spouse. Jamal finished reading and looked directly at the weeping mother and son. He explained that by aggressively forcing me to sign the post-nuptial agreement to protect Declan's pathetic non-existent assets, Beatrice had legally and permanently protected my entire $90 million empire from their grasp. Beatrice stared at the document, the horrific realization hitting her like a physical blow. Her own malicious trap had become the exact instrument of her absolute financial ruin. She had handed me the perfect legal shield to completely destroy them. Declan let out a fresh sob, realizing that the clause effectively stripped him of everything. He had stolen the vintage Porsche. He had pawned the title for illicit cash. He had attempted to commit mortgage fraud. He had conspired with his mother to forge an eviction notice. Every single one of his actions constituted severe documented financial infidelity and blatant fraud. I looked down at my husband, my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotion. I told him that he had violated the core tenets of the agreement within a week of our marriage. I stated that the postnuptial document legally severed any financial obligation I might have had toward him. He was walking away with absolutely nothing but the crushing weight of his catastrophic debts. I told Beatrice that her brilliant legal strategy had completely backfired. She had not protected her son. She had actively orchestrated his total financial destruction. I informed them that Vanguard Holdings would not offer a single penny of settlement money. I would not pay off Beatrice's massive gambling debts. I would not cover Declan's illicit pawnshop loans. They were entirely on their own, trapped in a nightmare of their own making. I sat back in my armchair, watching the complete and utter collapse of their toxic reality. The silence in the living room was absolute, broken only by the ragged, desperate weeping of the two people who had so arrogantly underestimated me. The legal ambush was flawlessly executed. The trap was sprung and they were firmly locked inside. The silence in my living room was broken by the sharp wail of approaching sirens. The sound cut through the freezing morning air. Declan lifted his head, his tear-stained face morphing from absolute despair to a flicker of desperate hope. Beatrice gasped, her manicured fingers clawing at her emerald green coat. She genuinely believed her earlier threats had miraculously manifested. She thought the authorities were arriving to rescue her and arrest me. She pushed herself up from the hardwood floor, struggling to stand on her designer heels. She loudly declared that her wealthy network had finally intervened and that I was about to be hauled away in handcuffs. I did not move from my velvet armchair. I simply glanced at Jamal. The brilliant corporate lawyer adjusted his tailored suit jacket, his expression devoid of mercy. He looked at Beatrice with the cold gaze of a predator, watching its prey step willingly into a snare. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the large bay windows, casting frantic, colorful shadows across the mahogany furniture. Heavy footsteps echoed on the stone porch. My undercover security operatives opened the front oak doors, stepping aside to allow two uniformed police officers and a plainclothes detective to enter the grand foyer. Beatrice surged forward, dramatically waving her arms to capture the attention of the detective. She pointed at me, screeching that I was a ruthless con artist who had stolen her son's property and orchestrated an elaborate corporate takeover to ruin their lives. She demanded that they place me under immediate arrest. The officers did not glance in my direction. They marched straight past my coffee table, ignoring the frantic, shrieking woman, and stopped directly in front of Jamal. The plainclothes detective reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded legal document. He looked at Jamal, confirming that the evidentiary files had been successfully processed by the district attorney. Jamal nodded affirmatively. He turned his attention back to Beatrice, who had suddenly stopped screaming, her arrogant posture melting into profound confusion. Jamal informed his mother-in-law that the police were not here to investigate my perfectly legal corporate acquisitions. He stated with razor-sharp precision that the authorities were here exclusively for her. Jamal explained that following the disastrous holiday party, he had taken his wife Penelope directly to the local precinct. Acting as her primary legal counsel, Jamal had officially submitted the documentation proving that Beatrice had maliciously stolen her own daughter's social security number. He had handed over the fraudulent commercial loan applications, the forged signatures, and the overwhelming evidence of identity theft used to fund her delusional luxury spa venture. He told Beatrice that the district attorney viewed identity theft against a family member as a severe premeditated felony. Beatrice turned the color of chalk. The remaining blood drained entirely from her face. She stumbled backward, bumping heavily into the marble fireplace surround. She stammered wildly, looking at Declan for support, but Declan was frozen in pure terror, incapable of defending himself. The detective stepped forward, officially stating her full legal name. He calmly informed Beatrice that she was under arrest for felony identity theft, wire fraud, and criminal conspiracy. I instructed her to turn around and place her hands behind her back. The command shattered the final remnants of her aristocratic facade. Beatrice erupted into a violent panic. She screamed that she was a prominent socialite, a respected member of the local country club, and that she could not be treated like a common criminal. She flailed her arms, attempting to push the uniformed officers away. It was a spectacular, deeply pathetic display of unwarranted entitlement. The officers did not tolerate her resistance. They moved with swift efficiency, grabbing her wrists and forcefully spinning her around. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking around her wrists echoed loudly through the living room. Beatrice shrieked, her voice cracking as she begged Declan to do something, to call her wealthy friends to fix this impossible situation. Declan simply looked away, tears streaming down his face, entirely consumed by his own impending financial ruin. The officers grabbed Beatrice by the arms of her emerald coat and marched her forcefully toward the grand foyer. She thrashed and kicked her designer heels, scraping against the polished hardwood floors. She screamed that this was all a terrible misunderstanding, cursing my name and swearing absolute vengeance. I stood up from my velvet armchair and followed them to the heavy oak front doors. I watched as the officers dragged her out onto the freezing stone porch. The crisp morning air carried the sound of her hysterical screaming straight down the quiet cobblestone street. The flashing police lights had drawn the attention of the entire upscale neighborhood. Wealthy residents, the very same elite socialites Beatrice had desperately tried to impress and manipulate, were standing on their pristine front lawns and peering through their expensive windows. They watched as the self-proclaimed matriarch of Boston high society was manhandled down the steps like a raving lunatic. Beatrice looked up, her tear-streaked face twisting in agony as she realized she was performing her final act in front of the exact audience she worshipped. The wealthy neighbors whispered and pointed in total disgust. They witnessed her being shoved into the waiting squad car. The heavy metal door slammed shut, sealing her inside. I stood on my porch, the freezing wind blowing through my hair, projecting unshakable calm. I watched the police cruiser pull away from the curb, its sirens blaring loudly as it carried Beatrice toward a cold cell and a public criminal trial. Her reputation, her social standing, and her fabricated reality were completely obliterated in front of the upscale neighborhood. The queen of the country club had been reduced to a handcuffed felon, stripped of her power, dignity, and freedom. I turned away from the fading sirens, my expression devoid of any mercy, ready to finish dismantling the pathetic husband she had left behind. I walked back through the heavy oak front doors. The freezing winter wind swept into the grand foyer, but the chill inside the house was entirely my own making. I closed the doors with a solid, echoing thud, sealing the remaining traitor inside my fortress. Jamal and the three elite corporate litigators stood in the living room, their expressions a mixture of professional satisfaction and utter disdain. I offered Jamal a brief, respectful nod. Jamal signaled to his team, and the four formidable attorneys walked out the back entrance, leaving me entirely alone with the shattered remains of my husband. Declan had not moved from his spot on the hardwood floor. He remained on his knees, his hands clutching the expensive fabric of his trousers. The arrogant finance executive who had strutted around my townhouse demanding respect was completely gone. In his place was a broken, terrified boy who finally realized the catastrophic consequences of his monumental greed. He slowly lifted his head, his eyes bloodshot and swollen from crying. He looked at the mahogany coffee table where the $90 million financial statement still sat, a glaring reminder of the empire he had thrown away. He called my name, stretching his trembling hand toward my tailored navy blue power suit. I did not step toward him. I stood perfectly still, my posture radiating absolute, unyielding authority. Declan began to grovel. He frantically attempted to rewrite the history of the past week, desperately trying to shift the entire blame onto his mother. He sobbed, claiming that Beatrice had completely brainwashed him. He swore that he never wanted to steal my car or forge the eviction notice, insisting that his mother had pressured him into making terrible decisions. He looked up at me with pathetic, pleading eyes, begging me to remember the man I married. He tried to invoke the memories of our wedding day, whining that he was still the ambitious man I had fallen in love with. I let him exhaust his pathetic excuses. When he finally stopped talking, I delivered the final crushing reality check. I kept my voice incredibly soft, which only made the words cut deeper. I told him that a good man does not sit silently while his mother humiliates his wife. A good man does not pawn a vintage vehicle to pay off illicit poker debts. A good man does not attempt to commit bank fraud to fund a delusional luxury spa. I informed him that I saw exactly who he was the moment he signed that post-nuptial agreement. I walked over to the hallway closet and opened the tall wooden door. I reached inside and pulled out a single battered canvas suitcase. It was the exact same cheap piece of luggage Declan had brought with him when he first moved into my townhouse. I had not packed his expensive designer suits, his luxury watches, or his premium leather shoes. Those items were purchased using the corporate allowance cards I funded, which meant they legally belonged to Vanguard Holdings. I had only packed the cheap, worn-out clothes he actually owned before we met. I dragged the small canvas suitcase across the marble floor of the foyer and left it standing upright near the front door. I walked back to the edge of the living room and looked down at him. I laid out his entire future with ruthless mathematical precision. I told him that his corporate finance career was permanently destroyed. The hostile takeover of his firm guaranteed he would never work in the financial sector again. I reminded him that he had no car because the vehicle he illegally pawned was currently being repossessed. I stated clearly that he had no wife as the post-nuptial agreement guaranteed a swift, merciless divorce with zero alimony. Finally, I outlined the massive crushing mountain of debt he now faced alone. Declan stared at the cheap canvas suitcase, the reality of his total annihilation finally sinking into his bones. He had nothing. He was nothing. He crawled forward on the hardwood floor, closing the distance between us. He grabbed the hem of my tailored trousers, openly weeping, his tears staining the expensive fabric. He begged for a second chance. He swore on his life that he loved me. He cried that he would do anything, work any job, and spend the rest of his life making it up to me if I would just let him stay. He pleaded for mercy, desperately trying to cling to the $90 million lifeline he had so foolishly tried to cut. I looked down at the pathetic broken man clutching my pant leg. I felt absolutely zero pity for him. I felt no sorrow for the destruction of our marriage. I felt only the cold, satisfying clarity of absolute justice. I reached down and firmly peeled his trembling fingers away from my clothing. I took a deliberate step backward, creating a permanent physical and emotional distance between us. I looked him dead in the eye, my expression devoid of any emotion, completely vacant of the love I once held for him. Then I delivered the final fatal blow. I told him, I am just a freelance furniture appraiser, Declan. You cannot afford me. I turned away from his horrified face. I walked over to the front door and opened it wide, letting the freezing winter wind whip into the foyer one last time. I pointed toward the stone steps, a silent, absolute command to leave my property. Declan slowly stood up, his body shaking violently. He grabbed the handle of his cheap canvas suitcase, his head hung low in ultimate defeat. He walked past me, a hollow ghost of the arrogant man he used to be. He stepped out onto the freezing porch. I did not wait for him to look back. I grabbed the heavy brass handle of the solid oak door and slammed it shut directly in his face. The heavy sound of the solid oak door slamming shut echoed through the grand foyer, marking the absolute end of my life in Boston. I stood in the quiet entrance, listening to Declan dragging his cheap canvas suitcase down the freezing stone steps. I did not look out the bay window to watch him walk away. I turned around, walked into my home office, and began making arrangements for my immediate departure. Boston held nothing for me. The townhouse had served its purpose as a temporary stage, a gilded cage where the toxic ambition of my husband and his mother had finally destroyed them. By noon the next day, I instructed my wealth management firm to list the property. I packed only items that held genuine personal value, leaving the imported furniture and the expensive artwork behind for the estate liquidators to handle. I boarded a private flight that same afternoon, leaving the bitter winter chill and the shattered remains of that family far behind me. 6 months passed. The transition from the quiet cobblestone streets of Boston to the relentless electric energy of New York City was exactly the kind of rebirth I needed. I purchased a breathtaking $20 million penthouse located high above the bustling streets of Manhattan. The residence spanned the entire top floor of a sleek modern high-rise featuring floor-to-ceiling glass walls that offered an unobstructed panoramic view of the iconic skyline. My boutique art consulting firm easily transitioned to the city, thriving seamlessly in the center of the global art market. I no longer needed to hide my wealth or pretend to be a struggling freelancer. I fully embraced the $90 million empire my father had built utilizing Vanguard Holdings to expand my philanthropic efforts and invest in innovative global technologies. The air in my new home felt entirely different. It was clean, untainted by the suffocating arrogance and desperate greed that had poisoned my previous life. It was a warm Friday evening in late June. The golden hour cast a brilliant, fiery glow across the towering skyscrapers, turning the city into a canvas of amber and deep violet. I stood on my expansive private balcony, the gentle summer breeze brushing against my silk evening dress. I held a delicate crystal glass filled with a rare vintage wine, watching the vibrant city lights slowly begin to flicker to life below. The massive sliding glass doors behind me were completely open, allowing the soft sounds of a jazz record to drift out from the spacious living room. My private chef was busy in the state-of-the-art kitchen, putting the final touches on an extravagant 5-course dinner. Tonight was a celebration of freedom, resilience, and the family we choose for ourselves. The private elevator chimed softly in the foyer, signaling the arrival of my guests. I stepped back inside, just as Jamal and Penelope walked into the penthouse. The transformation in Penelope over the past 6 months was nothing short of miraculous. Without the constant suffocating pressure of her mother dictating her every move, Penelope had finally discovered her own voice. She looked radiant, dressed in a vibrant crimson gown that perfectly matched her newfound confidence. She had officially divorced herself from the toxic legacy of Beatrice, completely changing her career path to focus on managing a nonprofit foundation dedicated to financial literacy for vulnerable women. Jamal walked proudly beside her, exuding that same brilliant, unshakable authority he had displayed in my Boston foyer. He was now the managing partner at a top-tier Manhattan law firm, while continuing to serve as my most trusted primary legal counsel. I greeted them both with warm, genuine embraces. There was no pretense, no underlying tension, and absolutely no need to constantly monitor our words. We had forged an unbreakable bond in the fires of that disastrous holiday season. We gathered around the massive marble dining table, laughing freely as the chef served the first course of seared scallops and caviar. The conversation flowed effortlessly, touching on the booming art market, our upcoming travel plans, and the exciting new initiatives Penelope was launching. We did not speak of Beatrice, who was currently serving a lengthy sentence in a federal facility for her extensive wire fraud and identity theft convictions. We did not mention her country club, her fake society friends, or the total obliteration of her manufactured reputation. That dark chapter was permanently closed. Jamal raised his glass, offering a heartfelt toast to new beginnings, to absolute honesty, and to the power of walking away from those who refuse to value your true worth. We clinked our glasses together, the crystal ringing with a clear, beautiful sound. It was a perfect evening, surrounded by the family I had actively chosen. As the chef brought out the dessert course, I felt a subtle vibration from the encrypted smartphone resting quietly beside my plate. I picked it up, glancing casually at the glowing screen. It was a brief automated legal notification forwarded by my wealth management team. The email contained a single formal document attachment. It was the official court confirmation that Declan had formally filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. He had exhausted every possible option, liquidated his final meager assets, and completely surrendered to the crushing mountain of debt he had built with his own two hands. He was officially ruined. I stared at the brief notification for exactly 2 seconds. I felt no lingering anger, no sense of pity, and absolutely no desire to reach out to him. I simply pressed the delete button, erasing the email and his entire existence from my life without a second thought. I placed the phone face down on the table, picked up my glass of vintage wine, and walked back out onto the balcony. I looked out over the glittering, endless expanse of the Manhattan skyline, breathing in the crisp evening air. I had protected my legacy. I had survived their betrayal. I had won. The story of Nora, Declan, and Beatrice serves as a masterful exploration of a crucial life lesson: true power lies in quiet confidence, strategic preparation, and the unyielding enforcement of personal boundaries. Throughout the narrative, Beatrice and Declan constantly utilized loud arrogance, public spectacles, and malicious gossip to assert their dominance. They operated under the toxic delusion that volume and perceived social status could easily crush someone they consistently underestimated. However, Nora never once resorted to their level of frantic hysteria. Nora's journey powerfully illustrates that you do not have to scream to be heard, nor do you need to aggressively justify your worth to people who are entirely committed to misunderstanding and exploiting you. Her ultimate victory was not born from a sudden emotional outburst, but from meticulous preparation and the quiet security of knowing exactly who she was. In our own lives, we frequently encounter individuals who attempt to diminish our value or take advantage of our generosity. Our natural human instinct is often to fight back loudly, to over-explain our side of the story, or to beg for the basic respect we inherently deserve. Yet the most devastating response to toxic behavior is simply refusing to participate in the drama while simultaneously protecting your own well-being. When you truly recognize your own worth, the desperate manipulative tactics of others lose all their power over you. We must learn to build our own fortresses, whether financial, emotional, or psychological, so that when malicious people try to tear us down, they only end up destroying themselves against our walls. Take a moment today to evaluate your own boundaries and ensure you are fiercely protecting your peace from those who seek to exploit it. If you have ever had to quietly outsmart a toxic person in your own life, I would love to hear your story, so please share your experience.